Imagine holding in your hands an object crafted nearly 2,000 years ago, a shimmering vessel that appears to shift color before your very eyes, glowing ruby red when lit from within, and turning a mysterious sea green when light passes through it from behind. This isn't a modern illusion or some digital trick. It's the legendary Lycurgus Cup, one of the most astonishing pieces of ancient Roman glass ever discovered. To this day, its breathtaking beauty and near magical properties leave experts and admirers utterly mystified. How could artisans from an ancient civilization, working without electricity, precision tools, or advanced scientific understanding, create something so sophisticated that we still struggle to fully comprehend its secrets? The more you look at it, the more it feels like holding a genuine miracle, one that bridges centuries and speaks directly to us across time. This video is an invitation to step back into that world, to walk alongside the master glassmakers of ancient Rome and uncover the techniques, innovations, and sheer artistry that produced objects which have not only survived the ages but continue to captivate us with their elegance and ingenuity. We often think of the Romans as conquerors, lawmakers, and builders of empires, but we sometimes overlook their role as some of history's most brilliant craftspeople. Their glassware wasn't just functional, it was luminous, delicate, and astonishingly advanced, blending science and art in ways that even modern makers are only beginning to appreciate. And that's exactly what we're going to explore together: the fascinating, and at times perplexing, world of Roman glassmaking. We won't just be talking about history. In this journey, you'll witness modern artisans, archaeologists, and scientists as they attempt to recreate these ancient marvels using only the tools, materials, and methods available to Roman craftsmen. Together, we'll uncover the clues left behind in shards of glass, in ancient texts, and in the silent testimony of artifacts that have waited patiently for their stories to be told. We'll witness triumphs, face stubborn mysteries, and maybe, just maybe, catch a glimpse of the brilliance that turns sand and fire into objects of timeless wonder. Are you ready to step into the workshop of the past and see how the impossible was made real? Let's begin. But to truly grasp the genius of Roman glassmakers, we first need to understand the sheer magnitude of their achievement. Picture this: a world where, for centuries, glass was a spectacular luxury. A material so rare and precious, it was often compared to gemstones. A single small vessel could be a king's ransom. Yet, by the height of the Roman Empire, that reality had been completely turned on its head. Glass was everywhere. It was no longer just for the elite. It was in the homes of everyday citizens, used for storing wine, holding perfumes, and even as window panes to let light into rooms. This wasn't a small-scale operation. It was the world's first true glass industry, a manufacturing revolution that stretched from the damp, cool frontiers of Britain all the way to the sun-baked markets of Egypt. The archaeological record screams this reality at us. At ancient port cities like Aquileia in Italy, archaeologists haven't just found a few delicate pieces. They've uncovered literal mountains of glass waste, mounds of broken shards, misfired batches and production debris that testify to massive, continuous, and industrialized production. It was a factory town, a hub of industry where furnaces likely burned day and night to meet an insatiable demand. And then there's Pompeii, the city frozen in time. The volcanic ash that so tragically entombed the city also acted as a perfect preservative, sealing everyday life in a snapshot. Here we find glass not as a rare treasure locked away, but integrated into daily existence. It's on the tables in cafes, holding oil in kitchens, and adorning the dressing tables of ordinary people. This explosion in availability presents us with our first great puzzle. How did they do it? How did Roman artisans move from crafting one-of-a-kind masterpieces for emperors to producing millions of sturdy, reliable, and often beautiful containers for the masses? This shift implies an incredible level of organization, a mastery of raw material supply chains, and a deep scientific understanding of controlling fire and chemistry on an industrial scale. They achieved a consistency in quality that is staggering. A simple bottle made in Gaul has the same chemical signature, the same color, and the same durability as one made in Syria. This wasn't haphazard. It was a standardized system of production, a network of knowledge and trade that functioned across thousands of miles without any modern communication. They somehow solved the problem of mass production 1700 years before the Industrial Revolution. And they did it with fire, sand, and human ingenuity. That monumental shift from rare luxury to everyday essential, that entire industrial machine, all started with just 3 humble ingredients. The Roman glassmaker's recipe was deceptively simple: sand, soda, and lime. But their true genius lay in knowing exactly where to find the very best versions of these materials and understanding, through centuries of trial and error, how they interacted. This wasn't just mixing dirt and ash. It was a precise, almost alchemical formula. The most critical component was the sand itself. Roman glassmakers weren't just scooping up any sand from the nearest beach. They became master geologists, seeking out specific deposits renowned for their quality. The most famous source was the river Belus in the Levant, whose sands were legendary. The Roman natural historian Pliny the Elder even wrote about it, describing how merchants would run their ships aground just to load up on this precious resource. Later, they found similarly excellent sand at the mouth of the Volturnus River in Italy. What made this sand so special? Its secret was a very low iron content. Iron is a common impurity in sand, and when melted in a glass furnace, it imparts a strong green or bluish tint. By seeking out these exceptionally pure sands, Roman artisans could create a product that was far clearer and more colorless, a blank canvas upon which they could build their art. But sand alone is incredibly stubborn. Its melting point is astronomically high, far beyond what ancient furnaces could achieve. To coax the sand into melting, they needed a flux, and their flux of choice was natron. This wasn't a manufactured chemical. It was a naturally occurring soda ash harvested from the evaporated beds of salt lakes, most notably in the Wadi el Natron in Egypt. Natron was a truly multifunctional material for the Romans. They also used it in mummification and as a cleaning agent. In glassmaking, its role was miraculous. When added to the sand and heated, the natron dramatically lowered the melting temperature of the silica, transforming it from unmeltable grains into a workable, viscous liquid. This Egyptian export became the engine of the entire Mediterranean glass industry, shipped in vast quantities to workshops everywhere. Then we have the third and perhaps most fascinating ingredient: lime. This one seems to have been a happy accident, a secret the Romans knew how to use but didn't fully understand scientifically. Lime, or calcium oxide, is found in seashells and limestone. Many of the prized sands from river mouths and coastal areas, like those from the Belus and Volturnus, were naturally contaminated with these tiny shell fragments. When this sand-natron mixture was melted, the heat broke down the shells, releasing lime into the melt. Unbeknownst to the Romans, this lime acted as a stabilizer. Without it, the resulting glass would be what we call water-soluble glass. If you poured water into a vessel made from unstable glass, the water would actually begin to dissolve the glass itself, making it weak and cloudy. The lime made the glass chemically durable, allowing it to withstand contact with liquids for centuries. They had empirically stumbled upon the perfect recipe for stability, achieving through practice what would take modern chemistry centuries to explain. This trio of materials, pure sand, Egyptian natron, and accidental lime, formed the foundation upon which every brilliant creation, from the simplest bottle to the Lycurgus Cup itself, was built. Now, with the perfect recipe in hand, we arrive at what might be the most daunting physical challenge these ancient industrialists faced: the furnace itself. We're not talking about a simple campfire or a cozy hearth for baking bread. To transform that stubborn mix of sand and natron into a shimmering liquid, Roman glassmakers needed to achieve, and more importantly, sustain temperatures exceeding 1,100 degrees Celsius. That's a heat so intense it begins to approach the melting point of copper. Generating that kind of energy, day in and day out, across an entire empire, was a logistical puzzle of staggering proportions. The fuel for this fiery transformation was wood, and lots of it. These weren't casual operations burning a few logs at a time. A single large-scale glass-making furnace, operating continuously through a production season, was a ravenous beast. Historians and archaeologists estimate that one such furnace could easily consume the entire wood yield from an acre of mature forest in just a single day. Multiply that by weeks and months of operation, and you begin to grasp the scale. It's likely that a major workshop with multiple furnaces could go through a small forest's worth of wood in a single season. This creates a vivid, almost smoky picture of the landscape around industrial hubs. In places like the Rhineland in Germany, which became a glass-making powerhouse, we can imagine a constant haze hanging over the valleys, the air thick with the scent of burning oak and beech, and the relentless sound of axes as teams of woodcutters worked to feed the endless hunger of the kiln. The choice of wood was not arbitrary. Different types of wood burn at different temperatures and for varying durations. Glassmakers would have prized dense hardwoods like oak, hornbeam, or beech. These woods burn hotter and longer than softwoods like pine, providing a more stable and intense heat that was absolutely crucial for maintaining the precise conditions needed inside the crucible. This demand created an entire secondary economy. Think of the supply chain required just to keep a single furnace lit. You needed foresters to identify and fell the right trees, teams of laborers or animals to haul the massive logs, and charcoal burners to often convert the wood into charcoal, which burns even hotter and more cleanly. All of this material had to be transported, likely by river given its weight, to the production sites. The organization was military in its precision, a constant, flowing convoy of fuel supporting the industrial effort. And this is where we encounter another layer of their ingenuity. How did they manage this resource-intensive process so efficiently without causing immediate and total ecological collapse in their vicinity? The answer likely lies in a sophisticated understanding of managed forestry and a vast trade network. They wouldn't have simply clear-cut the land around their workshops into a wasteland. It would have been economically suicidal. Instead, evidence suggests they practiced coppicing, a method where trees are cut back to a stump to allow them to regrow quickly in cycles, providing a sustainable, renewable source of wood. Furthermore, they would have sourced their fuel from a wide radius, using rivers like the Rhine as natural highways to float timber from managed forests many miles away. This ability to think on an imperial scale, to solve a local problem with resources from across a continent, is a testament to the Roman logistical mind. The glowing molten glass in a Rhineland workshop was ultimately made possible by the sweat of woodcutters in a distant forest, and the skill of boatmen navigating ancient waterways, all coordinated without a single telephone or email. It was a symphony of fire and logistics, all conducted to create something beautiful. Yet for all their mastery of materials and fire, the most profound revolution in Roman glassmaking arrived not with a grand imperial decree, but with a single brilliant and almost impossibly simple idea. Sometime in the 1st century before the Common Era, in the bustling, culturally mixed workshops of the Syro-Palestinian region, a nameless artisan had a flash of inspiration that would change the world. Before this moment, creating a glass vessel was a painstaking sculptural process. One common method, core forming, involved draping threads of molten glass over a shaped clay core, then painstakingly smoothing and tooling them into a vessel before the glass cooled and hardened. Another technique, casting, was like ancient metalworking, pouring molten glass into a mold. These methods were slow, labor-intensive, and produced heavy, thick-walled objects. They were beautiful, but they were not for the masses. Then someone picked up a long, hollow iron pipe, dipped one end into the pot of glowing, honey-like glass to gather a lump of it, put the other end to their lips, and blew. With nothing but their own breath, they inflated that molten gather into a perfect, thin-walled bubble. In that single act of creation, the entire industry was reinvented overnight. This was the birth of glassblowing, and its impact cannot be overstated. It was the equivalent of going from meticulously hand-copying books to inventing the printing press. Suddenly, a single artisan could produce in an hour what might have taken a full day before. The vessels they created were lighter, thinner, more symmetrical, and could take on forms that were previously unimaginable. This wasn't just an improvement. It was a quantum leap in technology. The sheer speed of its adoption across the Roman world is one of the most compelling parts of the mystery. There was no internet, no rapid global travel, yet within a single generation, this revolutionary technique had spread from its likely birthplace in the East to every corner of the empire, from Spain to Syria. How did it happen? The Romans built and maintained the greatest network of roads and sea lanes the ancient world had ever seen. Ideas traveled as fast as people and goods. It's easy to imagine a skilled glassblower, possessing this new and immensely valuable knowledge, boarding a ship bound for Italy. Upon arriving in a port like Puteoli, they might have set up a workshop, taking on local apprentices or demonstrating the technique to established artisans, who would have immediately seen its transformative potential. The knowledge would have spread like wildfire, from master to apprentice, from one workshop to the next, carried along the very trade routes that the Roman Empire had so meticulously built to consolidate its power. The empire didn't just conquer land, it connected minds, and glassblowing is a perfect example of an idea whose time had come, and that found the perfect network to carry it across the known world. This one innovation is what truly unlocked the mass production we see evidenced in the archaeological record, turning glass from a crafted luxury into an everyday essential. But to bring that brilliant idea of glassblowing to life, to actually shape breath into glass, the artisan needed the perfect intermediary, a tool that could withstand unbelievable extremes. That tool was the blowpipe, and its design was a marvel of ancient metallurgy in its own right. Envision a skilled blacksmith in a workshop not far from the glass furnaces, hammering a thick iron rod over a forge. His task wasn't to create a weapon or a plowshare, but a precision instrument. He would have carefully drawn out the iron, forging it into a long, straight tube, roughly 4 to 5 feet in length, and perhaps an inch in diameter. This hollow design was absolutely critical. It had to be a conduit for human breath. yet robust enough to be plunged repeatedly into a seething, corrosive pot of molten glass. The challenges this simple iron tube had to overcome were immense. Every time a glassblower gathered a glowing mass of glass onto the pipe's end, that metal was subjected to a thermal shock we can scarcely imagine. One moment it was at room temperature, the next, several inches of it were submerged in a liquid hotter than lava. This created a brutal temperature gradient along its length. The end in the glass might be glowing a faint cherry red itself, while just a foot or two away, the metal needed to be cool enough for a human hand to grip firmly. The iron also had to resist corrosion. The molten glass mixture, especially the fluxing agents like natron, is highly corrosive and would have slowly eaten away at the metal with each dip into the pot. A poorly made or thin blowpipe would have warped, cracked, or simply dissolved over time. This leads us to a fascinating archaeological silence. Given the scale of the Roman glass industry, we would expect to find thousands of these iron blowpipes littering excavation sites. Yet very few have ever been discovered. The likely reason is twofold. First, the constant thermal stress and corrosion meant these tools had a limited lifespan. They were consumable items, eventually worn out, recycled, or reforged into something else. Second, the part that endured the most punishment, the tip that was constantly dipped into the glass, would have been gradually consumed, leaving little recognizable evidence behind. So how do the glassmakers protect themselves from the intense heat traveling up the metal rod? The answer lies in a simple yet effective combination of material and technique. While the blowpipe itself was iron, the handle was almost certainly wood. A wooden sleeve would have been fitted over the cooler end of the pipe, providing a safe, insulated grip. But the artisan's skill was their primary defense. They developed a rhythmic, fluid motion, a dance with the fire. After gathering the glass, they wouldn't just stand still holding a heating rod. They would constantly, subtly rotate the pipe, preventing the molten gather from sagging off one side, but also ensuring that heat was distributed more evenly along the metal, preventing any one spot from becoming too hot to handle too quickly. This rotation wasn't just for shaping. It was a vital safety technique, a way to manage the dangerous energy of the furnace they commanded. The blowpipe was more than a tool. It was an extension of the artisan's body and breath, a testament to the blacksmith's craft, and the unsung hero that made the glassblowing revolution physically possible. So now we have our furnace roaring at over 1,000 degrees, our blowpipe in hand, and our perfect mixture of sand and soda, bubbling away inside a ceramic pot known as a crucible. This is where theory meets fire, where the craftsman becomes one with the process in a moment of incredible focus and danger. The first step, known as gathering, seems simple in description, but was an act of immense skill and courage. The worker would approach the furnace, a structure built of brick and clay that radiated a heat that felt like standing next to the sun. They would locate the glory hole, the opening that provided access to the crucible buried within the inferno. Inside that pot wasn't a solid material, but a seething molten lake they called the metal, glowing with an intense orange-white light. With a deep, steadying breath, the artisan would thrust the iron tip of the blowpipe into that opening, angling it down into the viscous liquid. This wasn't a careless dunk. It was a precise, controlled insertion. They wouldn't just scoop the glass up. Instead, they would begin to rotate the pipe, steadily and evenly, winding the molten material around the tip, much like a person would spin cotton candy onto a stick. The goal was to collect a symmetrical, even gather a perfect teardrop of liquid glass known as a parison. Any inconsistency in the rotation, any wobble or pause, would result in a lopsided mass that was nearly impossible to shape properly later on. They had to judge the weight and size purely by feel and years of experience, knowing exactly how many rotations were needed for the vessel they intended to make. And they had to do all of this while the surface of the molten glass threatened to form a stiff, cooler skin, and while avoiding any bubbles or impurities that might be lurking in the crucible. A single small bubble captured in that initial gather could weaken the entire vessel or ruin its clarity. This entire delicate operation happened in a matter of seconds, with the worker's face and hands exposed to a blistering wave of heat, their forearms protected perhaps only by leather wrappings. The margin for error was vanishingly small. A misstep could mean dropping the glowing gather onto the floor, or worse, splashing the incredibly sticky, napalm-like molten glass onto themselves or a nearby apprentice. This first contact with the metal was a test of nerve as much as skill. A physical, hands-on mystery of how these individuals, through sheer bravery and dexterity, repeatedly tamed a substance that was only moments away from being liquid fire. Holding that glowing, honey-like gather on the end of the blowpipe was only the beginning. The real magic, the true transformation from a lump of molten material into a vessel of light and form, happened with a single, controlled breath. The artisan would bring the pipe to their lips, but this wasn't about force. It was about immense finesse. They wouldn't blast air into the glass. Instead, they would deliver a gentle, steady puff, just enough to inflate the viscous gather from within, creating a small, shimmering bubble trapped inside the molten shell. This was the genesis of the form, the moment a solid object was given a hollow heart. But that first breath was incredibly delicate. Blow too hard or too fast, and the bubble would burst through the still soft outer layer, destroying the gather in a fiery spray. Blow too softly, and the bubble wouldn't form at all, leaving a solid, unusable mass. The glassmaker had to feel the resistance through the pipe, to sense the exact viscosity and temperature of the glass, and respond with precisely the right amount of pressure. It was a conversation between craftsman and material, conducted through a hollow iron tube. Once that initial air pocket was secured, the real shaping could begin. The artisan would then return to the marva, that smooth, flat slab of stone or metal that served as their primary workbench. They would roll the glowing globe over its cool, hard surface, simultaneously rotating the pipe to maintain perfect symmetry. This marvering action served several critical purposes. It cooled the outer skin of the glass just enough to make it more stable and workable. It smoothed the surface to a perfect cylinder, and it centered the bubble within the gather, ensuring the walls of the future vessel would be perfectly even. From this perfectly prepared bubble, an entire world of shapes became possible. The variety is what truly stuns the modern observer. By combining the constant, rhythmic rotation of the pipe with gravity, heat, and simple hand tools, a master could create almost anything. To make a long-necked bottle, the artisan might briefly heat the gather again to make it pliable, then quickly swing the pipe downwards like a pendulum. Centrifugal force would pull the molten glass, elongating the bubble into a slender, elegant neck. To create a wide, open bowl, they could do the opposite, reheating the glass and then blowing steadily while holding the pipe horizontal, allowing the bubble to expand outwards into a broad, flat disc. For a simple beaker, they would blow into a consistently rotated pipe, letting the form swell into a perfect cylinder before using shears to snip the end and create a clean lip. The central mystery, the thing that modern glassblowers still marvel at when they examine ancient pieces, is the incredible thinness and consistency of the walls. We are talking about vessels that are often less than a millimeter thick, yet they are flawlessly even from rim to base. How do they achieve this with no calipers, no lasers, no digital gauges? The answer lies in a profound, almost intuitive understanding of heat and timing. The artisan was constantly reheating the piece. They would blow for a few seconds, shape a little, then swing the pipe back toward the furnace to warm the glass in the glory hole for just a moment before pulling it out to blow and shape again. This cycle of heat and motion was a continuous dance. They knew that if the glass cooled too much, it would become stiff and resist shaping, risking a crack. If it got too hot, it would become too fluid and sag under its own weight, destroying the delicate symmetry. Their hands, their eyes, and their sense of feel were their only instruments for measuring this critical state. They could judge the temperature of the glass by its color. A bright orange-yellow was perfect for blowing, while a darker red indicated it was cooling and needed more heat. They could feel the weight distribution through the pipe, sensing if one side was becoming thicker than the other. This level of control, turning human breath into a calibrated tool, is what separated a master from an apprentice and allowed the Romans to produce not just functional ware, but objects of breathtaking lightness and elegance. Each vessel was a frozen moment of this beautiful, perilous dance between human intention and the wild, molten nature of glass itself. And so the dance continues. With the initial bubble formed and shaped on the marva, the glassmaker's hands would now fly into a flurry of activity, reaching for a suite of simple, almost primitive tools that were, in reality, extensions of their creative will. The marva was just the beginning. While its flat, stone surface was perfect for creating that initial symmetrical cylinder, a vessel needs a base to stand on, a lip to drink from, and a body with intention. This is where we move from pure breath to the art of manipulation, and the tools themselves become a central part of the mystery. How could such a limited array of objects, a wet wooden paddle, a pair of metal tweezers, a sharpened rod, produce such an astonishing variety of intricate and flawless forms? One of the most crucial tools was the block, a simple paddle made of water-soaked hardwood, often fruitwood like cherry or pear. Imagine the artisan, their face gleaming with sweat from the furnace's heat, dipping this wooden block into a bucket of water with a hiss of steam. They would then cradle the glowing, rotating glass bubble against the damp, curved surface of the wood. The steam created a cushion of vapor that prevented the wood from instantly burning while allowing the glassmaker to apply gentle, firm pressure. This wasn't about brute force, it was about guidance. By skillfully manipulating the rotating gather against the wet wood, they could perfectly smooth the surface, refine the spherical shape, and most importantly, begin to flatten the bottom of the vessel, creating a stable foundation known as a kick-up. This single humble tool was responsible for turning a wobbly, amorphous bubble into an object with structural integrity, all without leaving a single mark or scorch on the glass itself. Then came the jacks. These were not the playing cards, but a brilliant, tong-like tool made of iron. Picture two metal blades, each with a rounded, chisel-like end, connected by a central hinge. In the hands of a master, this simple device became impossibly versatile. They could use it like a giant pair of tweezers, gently pinching the molten glass near the end of the blowpipe to create a distinct neck for a bottle. With a slight twist of the wrist, they could press the blades into the soft glass to create decorative rings or patterns. But perhaps its most vital function was in the final act of creation, the separation. When the vessel was perfectly formed, the artisan would use the sharp edge of the jacks to make a deep, clean score around the neck of the piece, right where it met the blowpipe. A sharp tap on the pipe would then cause the vessel to crack off perfectly along that score line, leaving a clean, rough edge known as the pontal scar. This moment of separation was a tiny, controlled fracture. The moment the creation was cut loose from its maker, other tools filled out this minimalist kit. Pincers or tongs could be used to pull and twist bits of glass to form handles or decorative application. A pointed metal rod called a pontil rod would often be welded onto the base of the freshly separated vessel with a bit of hot glass, allowing the artisan to hold it while they finish the lip. To create the final, smooth rim, they would reheat the jagged edge in the furnace until it glowed soft, then use a variety of techniques. They might roll the lip on the marver to create a flat, even edge, or use the jacks to carefully flare it outwards into a graceful, open mouth. Every action was a response to the material's state, a continuous dialogue between the heat of the glass and the cool, deliberate touch of the tools. The true wonder lies in the staggering gap between the simplicity of the toolkit and the breathtaking complexity of the objects they produced. With just these few items, a blowpipe, a marver, a wet block, and a pair of jacks, Roman glassmakers created everything from delicate, thread-like cosmetic jars to massive, two-handled storage vessels called amphorae. They created bowls with perfectly flared rims, bottles with long, elegant necks, and beakers with intricate, wheel-cut designs. This paradox is the heart of the mystery. It forces us to understand that the real technology wasn't in the iron and wood they held in their hands. It was in the centuries of accumulated knowledge held in their minds and expressed through their fingertips. The tools didn't shape the glass. The artisan's profound skill did, using the tools as mere intermediaries. This minimalism speaks to a breathtaking efficiency of technique, where a single well-practiced motion with a simple tool could achieve what might take a modern studio artist several specialized gadgets to accomplish. Their greatest tool was their own expertise, a deep, intuitive language of heat, rotation, and pressure that turned basic implements into instruments of profound artistry. But a simple blown vessel, no matter how perfectly formed, was often just the beginning. To transform that elegant bubble into something truly functional, a jug to pour from, a jar to carry, a cup to stand proudly on a table, required a second act of creation, a series of delicate and perilous additions that pushed the artisan's skill to its absolute limit. This phase was all about thermal management, a high-stakes ballet where the main body of the vessel was slowly cooling and stiffening, while the craftsman had to introduce fresh, searingly hot molten glass to it. The margin for error was microscopic, and the coordination required was nothing short of breathtaking. Consider the application of a handle. The artisan, often working with an assistant or a second pipe, would have a separate gather of molten glass ready. They wouldn't simply glob it on. Instead, they'd use a technique called trailing. With a deft motion, they'd touch this smaller, hotter gather to the side of the now cooler vessel, and with a flick of the wrist, draw out a thin, sticky thread of glass. This initial connection was the most critical moment. If the main body was too cool, the new glass wouldn't bond, sliding off uselessly. If it was too hot, the added stress and heat could cause the entire vessel to warp or collapse under its own weight. The timing had to be exquisitely precise. Once that initial trail was attached, the real artistry began. Using simple tools like pincers or even a wet wooden stick, the glassmaker would then manipulate this glowing thread, pulling it, twisting it, and gracefully shaping it into a strong, ergonomic handle, all while constantly rotating the main vessel on the pipe to prevent it from sagging. In a matter of seconds, a purely decorative trail was transformed into a structural support, a curve that fit perfectly in the hand, all crafted freehand under intense pressure. The final lip or rim of a vessel demanded a different kind of precision. When the vessel was cracked off the blowpipe, it left a rough, broken edge that was not only sharp, but also structurally weak. To finish it, the artisan employed a technique called fire polishing. They would carefully reintroduce the entire rim to the intense heat of the glory hole. rotating it steadily just until the very edge began to glow a soft orange again. At this precise moment, the sharp, microscopic fractures of the break would melt away. The surface tension of the liquid glass pulling the edge into a perfectly smooth, rounded and strong rim. It was a process of healing the glass with fire, but it required an incredibly delicate touch. A moment too long in the heat, and the entire rim could soften and flare out uncontrollably, ruining the vessel's intended shape. Too little heat, and the edge would remain sharp and fragile. Perhaps the most ingenious of these finishing touches was the addition of a coiled foot or base. For an elegant drinking cup or a small bowl to sit level on an uneven surface, a simple kicked-up base wasn't always enough. The solution was to create a separate ring of glass and fuse it on. The artisan would create a small, donut-shaped ring by bending a trailed thread of glass into a circle, or by blowing a small, hollow ring. This new component, fresh from the furnace and piping hot, would then be brought into contact with the base of the now significantly cooler vessel. The skill here was in managing the thermal differential. The hot ring had to be just fluid enough to weld itself perfectly to the cooler base without transferring so much heat that it caused the main body to slump. Once attached, the ring could be tooled and shaped, often pressed flat on the marva to create a stable, level foot that elevated the entire piece, turning a simple bowl into an object of ceremony and status. Each of these additions, the handle, the polished rim, the coiled foot, was a testament to an intimate, almost supernatural understanding of the material's behavior. A mastery that allowed them to repeatedly perform what looks to us like a minor miracle of thermal engineering with nothing but fire, iron, and flawless timing. Yet even with all this breathtaking skill in freehand blowing and manipulation, the Romans faced a fundamental limitation of time. A master artisan could produce a simple vessel with incredible speed. But what about complex designs? How could they possibly meet the massive demand for decorated ware? For cups and jars adorned with intricate patterns, detailed faces, or entire mythological scenes, without each one taking hours of painstaking effort by a supremely skilled carver. The answer to this commercial and artistic puzzle arrived in the form of one of their most ingenious innovations, mold blowing. This technique was a stroke of pure industrial genius, a way to merge the speed of blowing with the complexity of sculpture. The concept was brilliantly simple, yet its execution was anything but. An artisan would begin not with a blowpipe, but with a block of terracotta or stone. Into this dense material, a master carver would carefully chisel a negative design, a hollow cavity that was the exact mirror image of the intended final product. This mold itself was a work of art, often featuring incredibly fine details: the curls of hair on a god's head, the feathers on an eagle's wing, the intricate weave of a basket. Some molds were one piece, designed for simple beakers. Others were multi-part, constructed from two or more sections that could be clamped together to form a complex three-dimensional shape, like a square bottle or a jar with handles integrated directly into its sides. The glassmaker's process then became a breathtaking act of trust and precision. They would gather a parison of molten glass on the blowpipe, just as before, but instead of blowing it freely into the air, they would carefully insert that glowing gather deep into the waiting mold. The moment of insertion was critical. The gather had to be the perfect size and temperature. Too small, and it wouldn't fill the mold's details. Too large or too hot, and it would fuse to the terracotta, destroying both the vessel and the mold in a ruined, stuck mass. Then, with the mold closed tightly around the pipe, the artisan would blow. Their breath would force the soft glass to expand outwards, pressing it into every single crevice, groove, and line carved into the mold's interior. In a matter of seconds, the blank bubble was transformed. As they withdrew the pipe, they would pull out a perfectly formed vessel, its entire surface now covered with a sharp, crisp, and intricate design that had been literally impressed upon it from the inside out. The variety of designs they achieved through this method is staggering. Archaeological finds include molds for beakers with entire chariot races circling their sides, jars with raised designs of grapes and vines, and cups featuring the faces of emperors or popular gladiators, turning each vessel into a piece of mass-produced propaganda or pop culture. This technology allowed for a level of detail and repeatability that was previously unimaginable. A single, finely crafted mold could be used to produce hundreds, even thousands of identical vessels, each one a perfect replica of the last. It was the ancient equivalent of pressing a vinyl record or minting a coin, a way to perfectly reproduce art on an industrial scale. This brings us to one of the most famous and beautiful mysteries of ancient glass, cameo glass, exemplified by the legendary Portland vase. This astonishing object, made of dark blue glass overlaid with a pure white glass cut away to form a sculptural scene of figures, was long thought to be the pinnacle of painstaking hand carving. But some experts now theorize that its creation might have involved a mold blowing technique of almost unbelievable sophistication. The hypothesis suggests that a craftsman may have first blown a gather of white glass into a mold carved with the intricate design, creating a blank vessel with the scene standing out in relief. Then, in an act of thermal bravery, they would have gathered that entire white vessel in yet another layer of molten blue glass, fusing the two layers together in the furnace before a master carver ever touched it. The subsequent carving would then be a process of carefully removing the top blue layer to reveal the white figures beneath. But the hard work of sculpting the complex forms would have already been done by the mold. Whether this specific theory is correct or not, it highlights the incredible inventive spirit of these artisans, who constantly sought new methods to harness heat and pressure to do the work of countless hours of manual labor. The precision of their molds and the flawless execution of this process, achieving perfect definition without the glass sticking, remains a powerful testament to a level of technical confidence we are still working to fully understand. But after mastering the form, the Romans faced their most vibrant and perplexing challenge: the mystery of color. The ability to transform their clear, blank canvas into a spectrum of stunning hues from deep, lapis lazuli blues to fiery, ruby reds, was a form of ancient alchemy. Their palette was not derived from paints or dyes, but from the very earth itself, and their understanding of how to unlock these colors from raw minerals represents one of their most profound, if entirely empirical, scientific achievements. They were manipulating chemistry at an atomic level, all while believing they were simply working with the properties of different stones and metals. The foundation of this color magic was their base glass itself, which, as we've seen, could range from nearly water clear to a faint natural green, or blue due to trace iron impurities. To override this and create intentional, powerful colors, they introduced specific mineral additives to the molten glass batch. Each mineral acted like a key, unlocking a different part of the spectrum. For a rich, royal blue that could mimic precious sapphire, they turned to cobalt. Just a tiny amount of cobalt oxide, ground from minerals like cobaltite, would produce an intensely deep and saturated blue that remains vibrantly unchanged even after 2 millennia. To create the regal purple and amethyst tones so prized by the imperial family, they used manganese. Interestingly, manganese had a dual personality. In small doses, it could produce those beautiful purples, but in larger quantities or under different furnace conditions, it could also act as a decolorizer, cancelling out the unwanted green tint from iron impurities to create that prized clear glass. The most dramatic and sought-after colour was a true opaque red. A colour so challenging to produce it was reserved for the most prestigious items. This, Pompeii red, was achieved through a sophisticated dance between copper and lead. They would add copper scales or filings, along with a significant amount lead oxide, to the glass batch. Under the right conditions, minute particles of metallic copper would precipitate out within the glass matrix. When light hit these suspended particles, they would scatter it, creating that stunning, saturated blood red opacity. For bright, opaque yellows and whites, they used antimony. Antimony oxide created a compound called calcium antimonate that would form as tiny white crystals throughout the glass, making it perfectly opaque and either creamy white or a brilliant sun yellow, often used to mimic the appearance of more expensive ivory or precious stones. However, the true secret, the factor that turned this from a simple recipe into a high-stakes art, was their masterful control of the furnace atmosphere. The same metal could produce wildly different colors based on whether it was fired in an oxidizing or a reducing environment. Think of it as the difference between a fire burning with a clear, bright flame full of oxygen, and a fire that is smothered, smoky, and starved for air. Copper is the perfect example of this astonishing transformation. In an oxidizing kiln, one with plenty of oxygen feeding, the flame's copper would dissolve into the glass and produce a beautiful transparent turquoise or light blue. But in a reducing atmosphere, a smoky, oxygen-starved environment, that very same copper would behave completely differently. Instead of dissolving, it would form those tiny colloidal particles we mentioned, creating that spectacular opaque red. They were essentially controlling the chemistry of the flame to determine the chemistry of the color. The staggering part of this entire process is that the Roman glassmakers had no concept of atoms, molecules, or oxidation states. Their knowledge was not derived from textbooks or scientific principles, but from centuries of meticulous observation, painstaking experimentation, and the careful handing down of hard-won recipes from master to apprentice. They knew through practice that if they added a pinch of this particular crushed rock and then choked the air supply to the fire at a specific moment, they would get a brilliant red. They knew it worked, but the why remained a complete mystery to them. They were following a map without any understanding of the underlying geography. This empirical mastery allowed them to achieve a consistency that is frankly baffling. A red glass bead made in a workshop in Cologne, Germany, would have the exact same chemical signature and color as one made in Alexandria, Egypt. This suggests that these potent, secret recipes were not just local folklore. They were valuable, protected knowledge that traveled along the same trade routes as the glass itself. A standardized chemical language spoken in the intense heat of furnaces across the entire empire. Their ability to reliably produce these vivid, stable colors, all while blind to the fundamental science, remains one of the most elegant and enduring mysteries of their craft. Yet, for all their mastery of vibrant and opaque colors, the ultimate expression of Roman glassmaking lies in an effect that seems to defy the very nature of reality itself. An object that doesn't just hold a single color, but possesses the magical ability to change its entire appearance based on the light around it. This is the realm of dichroic glass, and its most famous and only complete surviving example is the Lycurgus Cup. This singular artifact represents such a profound leap in technical sophistication that it stands apart, not just from other Roman glass, but from almost anything else produced in the ancient world. To behold it is to witness a genuine ancient miracle. Under normal reflected light, the cup appears a subdued, opaque jade green, like sea glass washed up on a shore. It's beautiful, but it doesn't immediately scream of otherworldly technology. The magic reveals itself only when a light source is placed behind it. When lit from within, the entire vessel undergoes a breathtaking transformation, glowing with an intense, translucent ruby red, as if filled with liquid fire. This isn't a trick of the light or a simple pigment. It's a precise physical phenomenon, and unlocking its secret would require sciences that wouldn't be formally discovered for another 1,000 years. For decades, the cup was an utter enigma, a puzzle that defied every conventional explanation. The breakthrough came only with the advent of powerful tools the Romans could never have conceived of: the electron microscope and molecular spectroscopy. When scientists finally placed a tiny fragment of the cup under this incredible magnification, they discovered the secret. Embedded within the glass matrix were billions upon billions of microscopic particles of gold and silver, each one measuring between 50 and 100 nanometers in diameter. To put that into perspective, a nanometer is 1/1000th of a meter. These particles are about 1,000 times smaller than the width of a human hair. The Romans had, entirely by accident, or through unimaginably precise empirical experimentation, created a colloid of precious metals in glass. The science behind the color change is known as surface plasmon resonance. In simplest terms, when light hits these tiny metal particles, the electrons on their surface begin to oscillate or vibrate in unison. The size and composition of the particles dictate the specific frequency of light these oscillations interact with. The gold-silver alloy in the Lycurgus Cup is tuned to the spectrum of visible light in a very specific way. When light shines onto the cup reflected light, our eyes primarily perceive the green and blue wavelengths that are scattered by these oscillating particles. But when light shines through the cup, transmitted light, the particles allow the red wavelengths to pass through predominantly, creating that stunning crimson glow. They weren't using dyes, they were engineering light itself at a sub-microscopic level. This revelation catapults the cup from a mysterious artifact into a monument of human ingenuity. The Romans had effectively stumbled upon nanotechnology 17 centuries before the term was even coined. They were manipulating matter at a scale so minute that it is completely invisible to the naked eye. And they were doing it with a consistency that is utterly baffling. The process to create this effect is not simple. Even with our modern understanding, it requires a precise recipe, adding a specific, minuscule amount of gold and silver, dust likely as a pre-made alloy to the glass batch. Then, during a secondary, carefully controlled heating process called striking, those metal particles must be encouraged to precipitate out of the solution and form at that exact, incredibly tiny nanometer scale. Too much heat and the particles grow too large, turning the glass an opaque, muddy red. Too little heat, and they don't form at all, leaving the glass clear. The margin for error is almost non-existent, and this is where we arrive at the deepest, most compelling mystery of all. How did they possibly discover this? They had no microscopes to see what they were creating. They had no spectrometers to analyze the light transmission. They had no concept of nanoparticles or electron behavior. Did a Roman glassmaker, in a moment of sheer serendipity, toss a piece of gold leaf or a silver coin into a crucible as an experiment, only to later discover that the resulting lump of glass had this miraculous property? And if so, how do they then reverse engineer that happy accident into a repeatable process, fine-tuning the particle size through temperature control with such exactitude that they could produce the flawless effect we see in the cup? Or was this the pinnacle of a long, lost tradition of experimental alchemy? a secret formula passed down through generations of masters who knew that combining these exact ingredients under these exact conditions produced the red that glows, even if they never knew why. The Lycurgus Cup stands alone, with no other intact examples of its kind. Was it the only one that worked? Or was it the sole survivor of an entire class of vessels that represented the absolute highest achievement of their craft? A technology so advanced and so delicate that it was always incredibly rare. It is a solitary data point, a masterpiece that whispers of an entire world of lost knowledge, leaving us to wonder if we are only seeing a fraction of what these ancient artisans were truly capable of creating. And if the Lycurgus Cup represents the peak of Roman manipulation of light itself, then cameo glass stands as the absolute zenith of their sculptural ambition in the medium. This technique moves beyond color and into the realm of three-dimensional narrative, transforming a simple vessel into a breathtaking white-on-blue sculpture. The process began not with carving, but with an act of incredible thermal daring. A glassmaker would first gather a parison of intensely colored glass, typically a deep cobalt blue. Before blowing it, they would roll this glowing gather over a marva scattered with fragments of opaque white glass. The searing hot blue core would instantly fuse these white pieces to its surface. The artisan would then return to the glory hole to melt this new, layered mass into a perfectly smooth, homogeneous bubble. Sometimes the process was repeated, dipping the now white-coated gather into yet another pot of colored glass to create 3 or even more distinct layers. This alone was a high-wire act. Each layer had to have a nearly identical coefficient of expansion. They had to shrink at the same rate as they cooled. A mismatch would guarantee that the finished piece would crack apart from internal stress as it cooled. A flaw that could take hours or even days to reveal itself. Once this meticulously crafted blank had been annealed and cooled, it was handed over to a master carver, a specialist whose skills bridged the worlds of gem cutting and sculpture. Their toolkit was not one of fire and breath, but of abrasives and relentless patience, using wheels made of copper, bronze, or even hard stone, and employing a slurry of ever finer abrasives like powdered emery or sand. They would begin the years-long process of grinding away the white upper layer to reveal the dark blue background beneath. This was subtractive art in its purest and most perilous form. Every stroke was permanent. A slip of the hand, a moment of too much pressure, and the carver could grind straight through the white layer, cut into the blue core, and ruin the entire piece. They worked entirely by feel and eye, with no X-rays to guide them to the depth of the layers, gradually bringing intricate scenes of gods, heroes, and mythological tableaus out of the white depths. The level of detail they achieved is simply staggering. On masterpieces like the Portland vase, we can see the subtle musculature of a hero's back, the delicate folds of a goddess's robe, and the individual leaves on a tree, all rendered in crisp relief with a precision that rivals any hardstone cameo. To appreciate the scale of this endeavor, consider that creating a piece like the Portland vase likely represented a multi-year investment of labor by a team of the most highly skilled artisans in the empire. This was not industry. This was high art, pushing the material and human limits of what was possible. Which leads us to the profound and lingering mystery: why? In an empire that had perfected mass production through mold blowing, why would anyone commit such insane amounts of time, resources, and risk to create something so fragile and difficult? The answer lies not in utility, but in statement. Objects like the Portland vase or the great cameo glass vessels were never meant for everyday use. They were ultimate luxuries, designed for an audience of one, the imperial household, or the super elite of Roman society. They were proclamations of power, breathtaking advertisements of what the Roman world could command. They said, "We possess not only the wealth to fund this, but we also control the handful of human beings on the planet with the skill to execute it." They were meant to evoke awe, to create a tangible, physical distance between the owner and everyone else. In a world full of mass-produced beauty, the cameo glass object stood apart as a singular, unrepeatable masterpiece, a Mount Everest of craftsmanship scaled not for practicality, but simply because it was there. Even after a vessel was perfectly blown, cooled, and removed from the pontal rod, its journey was often far from over. For many pieces, this was merely the transition from the fiery chaos of the hot shop to the deliberate, dusty precision of the cutting workshop. Here, in a space filled with the constant, grinding whir of spinning wheels, the glass object underwent its final transformation, not with heat, but with abrasion. This process, known as cold working, was where a clear bottle could become a glittering prism of light, and a simple bowl could be inscribed with the name of its owner or a scene from mythology. The primary tool of this trade was the lathe, but it was a far cry from the metalworking lathes we might imagine today. Picture a simple horizontal axle, turned either by a foot treadle or by an apprentice cranking a hand wheel. Mounted onto this spinning axle were interchangeable wheels, not of steel, but of stone, tough, durable materials like sandstone or limestone, or even harder metals like copper or bronze. The true cutting agent wasn't the wheel itself, but a constant stream of abrasive slurry fed onto its surface. This slurry was a simple, muddy mix of water and an incredibly fine, hard grit, typically powdered emery, or simply fine sand. The craftsman would hold the cooled glass vessel firmly against the spinning, slurry-fed wheel, and through patient, relentless pressure, the abrasive particles would microscopically grind away the glass surface, cutting a groove, creating a facet, or eventually revealing an entire intricate design. The variety of effects they achieved with this seemingly crude setup is astonishing. For functional wear, they might simply grind a flat base onto a rounded bottle, so it wouldn't tip over. But for decorative pieces, this is where their artistry truly shone. Using wheels of different diameters and edges, they could create entire patterns. A small, thin wheel could cut a deep, narrow groove to outline a figure. A broader, flat wheel could be used to create wide, shallow facets that caught the light, making a simple beaker sparkle like a gemstone. They mastered the technique of chip carving, making a series of small, overlapping concave cuts that created complex geometric patterns, or left behind raised ridges in the shape of leaves or vines. The entire surface of a vessel could be transformed into a dazzling array of light-catching planes, a technique known as faceting, which turned ordinary glass into something that rivaled the brilliance of rock crystal. This work required a completely different kind of skill from glassblowing. Where the glassblower relied on fluid motion, heat, and intuition, the cutter needed the steady hand of a surgeon and the patient eye of a draftsman. Their canvas was a hard, curved, and often fragile surface. Every cut was permanent. A slip of the hand could scratch the surface irreparably or, worse, create a fracture point that would cause the entire vessel to crack days or weeks later. The mystery lies in their breathtaking precision. Examining a piece like the famous Dartretter or cage cups, where the outer surface is carved into an intricate net-like pattern that stands completely separate from the inner body of the vessel, connected only by tiny, unseen bridges. It is almost impossible to believe this was done freehand. They were carving in negative space, judging the remaining thickness of the glass purely by feel and sound, on a lathe that offered no guards, no clamps, and no magnification. It represents a level of spatial awareness and manual control that seems almost superhuman. This leads us to the final layer of the mystery, the organization of the workshop itself. A single master artisan was unlikely to be an expert in both the volatile art of blowing and the meticulous art of cutting. The evidence suggests that Roman glass production was highly specialized, a true assembly line of ancient craftsmanship. In a large urban workshop, you would likely find distinct areas, almost separate shops under one roof. In one corner, the vitrarii worked, the masters of fire who gathered, blew, and shaped the raw glass into blank vessels. Once these blanks were annealed and cooled, they would be passed to the diatritarii, the elite cutters who were the sculptors of cold glass. There might even been a third group, the polishers, who used increasingly finer abrasives, even down to felt wheels and powders like rotten stone or ash, to grind out the scratches from the cutting process and bring the finished piece to a brilliant, glossy shine. This specialization explains the incredible quality and consistency. It wasn't that one genius could do everything, but that a team of experts, each a master of their specific domain, could collaborate to turn a lump of molten sand into an object of unparalleled luxury and technical achievement. The cold workshop, with its grinding wheels and patient, meticulous labor, was where the rough magic of the furnace was refined into its most enduring and elegant form. So who are the modern minds attempting to solve these ancient mysteries? They are a unique alliance of historians, materials scientists, and artisans. A band of interdisciplinary detectives who have traded textbooks for blowpipes and laboratories for reconstructed kilns. They are not simply replicating objects. They are reverse engineering an entire lost mindset, a philosophy of making that vanished with the empire itself. Leading this charge are teams like the Roman Glassmakers Project, a collective where the theoretical knowledge of an archaeologist, like Dr. Sarah Jennings, meets the furnace-tempered intuition of a master glassblower like Mark Taylor. Their collaboration is a constant dialogue across centuries, where a chemical analysis from a scanning electron microscope must be translated into a tangible gesture at the glory hole. In university labs, like those at Sheffield or Copenhagen, experimental archaeologists meticulously track every variable, from the type of hardwood used as fuel to the exact mineral composition of a sand sample, treating each firing not as an art project, but as a rigorous scientific experiment that produces publishable data with every success, and perhaps even more importantly, with every failure. These modern investigators approach their work with a unique humility. They understand that their greatest teacher is not our ancient text, but the material itself. Every attempt to recreate a Roman process is a conversation with the glass, and the glass always has the final say. A batch that fails to melt properly reveals the critical importance of that specific Egyptian natron. A vessel that cracks hours after cooling points to an annealing schedule that was too rapid, teaching them about the Roman understanding of thermal stress in a way no historical account ever could. A color that turns out muddy brown instead of a brilliant Pompeii, red, speaks volumes about the precise atmospheric conditions inside the furnace that a written recipe could never capture. Their workbench is littered with these beautiful failures, each one a vital clue that gets them one step closer to the empirical truth. The process itself is a form of deep, empathetic archaeology. It's one thing to read Pliny the Elder's description of the brilliant sands of the river Belus. It's another entirely to physically source that sand, to feel its unique grain between your fingers, and to experience firsthand how its low iron content indeed produces a far clearer glass than common beach sand. It's in these moments that the gap of 2,000 years suddenly narrows, when a modern glassblower, after days of struggle, finally manages to consistently produce a parison that doesn't sag or spin off the pipe. They share a moment of pure, triumphant understanding with a Roman artisan who faced the exact same challenge. They are not just studying history. They are physically re-embodying it, muscle by muscle, breath by breath, in the searing heat of a reconstructed ancient workshop. This is the heart of their mission: to bridge the gap between the known and the unknown, using fire, sand, and human curiosity to illuminate the shadows of the past, translating those archaeological blueprints into a living, breathing, and most importantly, working furnace is where the theoretical meets the physical, and where modern recreators face their first truly monumental challenge. You can't just build any kiln. You have to build a very specific, incredibly efficient Roman kiln. A design honed over centuries to achieve the impossible with pre-industrial materials. The teams begin by looking at the best preserved examples, like the workshops excavated at Dazzling in Israel, or the massive production sites in Italy's Aquileia. These aren't just piles of old bricks, they are the ghosts of industrial engines. Archaeologists carefully map the foundations, the thickness of the walls, the size and shape of the firebox, the placement of flues, and the crucible seating areas. Every dimension is a clue to a thermal secret. The first major hurdle is the materials. A modern brick or standard clay simply won't survive the thermal punishment. The Romans built their furnaces from a specially formulated refractory material, a type of fire clay often tempered with crushed pottery sherds, sand, or even crushed fired bricks, known as grog. This wasn't just dirt. It was a custom-engineered ceramic designed to withstand repeated thermal cycling without cracking apart. Sourcing the right clay is a quest in itself. The modern teams often have to seek out specific local deposits, testing different soils for their plasticity and heat resistance, just as a Roman furnace builder would have done. Then they must mix in their own grog, painstakingly crushing old bricks or pottery to the correct consistency to mimic the ancient recipe. The walls they build are massive, often over a foot thick, not just to contain heat, but to act as a thermal battery, soaking up energy and radiating it back inward to maintain a stable temperature. The internal architecture is a masterpiece of empirical design. The firebox is not a simple open chamber. It's carefully shaped to create a specific draft, drawing air in through a stoking hole and forcing the flames and hot gases on a precise path through the system. The key feature is the perforated floor, or the hot gases would simply shoot straight up the chimney. The crucibles of glass sit in chambers called glory holes above this intense, focused heat. The mystery the modern builders are trying to solve is how the Romans achieved such even and consistent heat distribution. A poorly designed furnace will have hot spots and cold spots, guaranteeing a failed batch of glass as some of it melts, while the rest remains stubbornly gritty. The Roman design, with its baffles and channels, seems to create a turbulent, swirling vortex of heat that envelops the crucibles evenly. A fluid dynamics puzzle solved through 2,000-year-old engineering. Then comes the true test, the first firing. This isn't a matter of lighting a match and walking away. It is a days-long ritual of slowly, patiently bringing the colossal structure up to temperature. You cannot heat a several-ton clay monolith quickly. The thermal shock would cause it to fracture and fail. For the first 24 hours, they might only have a small, smoldering fire inside, just enough to drive the residual moisture out of the clay walls. You can actually see the steam weeping from the joints. Over the next day, they slowly ramp up the heat, adding more wood incrementally. The sound changes from a hiss to a deep, roaring rumble as the furnace awakens. The outside walls begin to glow a faint red, and the true consumption begins. This is where they confront the sheer, staggering fuel appetite of the ancient industry. A furnace like this, once at full operating temperature of over 1,100 degrees Celsius, is a ravenous beast. To maintain that inferno, a team of volunteers must work in shifts, constantly feeding hardwood logs into the firebox. It's not just about throwing wood in. It's about selecting the right type of wood, dense oak or beech that burns long and hot, and placing it in the firebox to maintain the perfect balance of fuel and air. The teams quickly learn that this is a full-time job for several people. The historical estimates become visceral reality. You can literally watch an entire stack of carefully seasoned timber disappear into the flames over the course of an afternoon. It transforms your understanding of the Roman industry from an intellectual concept into a physical, exhausting, and smoky truth. A relentless demand that would have shaped the entire landscape and economy around these ancient workshops. The quest to rebuild a Roman furnace is only half the battle. The other half is finding the right ingredients to fill it. For the modern recreators, this becomes a global treasure hunt, a journey back in time through geology and geography. They aren't just looking for any sand or any soda ash. They are on a mission to find the exact materials the Romans prized, because they know from bitter experience that even a slight variation in composition can mean the difference between brilliant success and a crucible full of useless, gummy failure. This search for authenticity takes them across continents and deep into the historical record, following the same ancient trade routes that once fueled an empire's thirst for glass. The most elusive prize, the true holy grail of this endeavor, is natron. This naturally occurring soda ash was the magical flux that made the entire process possible. And for the Romans, its source was no mystery. It came almost exclusively from the dry, salt-crusted lake beds of the Wadi el-Natron in Egypt, a place so central to the industry that its name is forever linked to the chemical. For the modern teams, simply buying modern soda ash from a chemical supply company would defeat the entire purpose. They need the real thing, with all its natural impurities and unique mineral signature. But obtaining it is a monumental challenge. The Wadi el-Natron is still there, but its deposits are now largely commercialized and protected. Gaining access requires navigating a labyrinth of permits, local authorities, and logistical nightmares. Even if they succeed, the cost of extracting and shipping a meaningful quantity of this specific mineral from Egypt to a workshop in Europe or America is astronomically high. This immediate, tangible obstacle makes the ancient Roman logistics suddenly seem breathtakingly efficient. It viscerally illustrates why glassmaking was initially an Eastern Mediterranean industry, blossoming in places like Alexandria and the Levant that had easy access to both the pristine sands of the river Belus and the natron deposits just a short sail away. The material itself dictated the map of the industry. Their search then turns to the sand, reading Pliny's enthusiastic accounts of the brilliant white sands of the river Volturnus in Italy. The teams might head to the modern Volturno River mouth with high hopes, only to find a landscape drastically changed by 2 millennia of sedimentation, agriculture, and industrial development. The specific deposits the Romans mined are likely buried deep under meters of soil, or have been washed out to sea. This forces a fascinating exercise in archaeological geology. They must become detectives, studying core samples and historical maps to deduce where the ancient coastline lay, and where those legendary sandbanks might have been located. When they finally secure a batch of sand they believe is a close match, the first test is a simple visual one. They compare it to sand from a common beach. The difference is often immediately obvious. The modern beach sand is typically a warm, yellowish color, stained by iron oxides. The sought-after ancient sand is often strikingly white or pale gray, visibly purer. But the true test comes in the furnace. The high iron beach sand will always produce a greenish, bubbly glass, while the low iron sand from a historic source will yield a far clearer, more workable material. This hands-on experimentation solves the mystery of why the Romans were so particular about their sand sources. They weren't being fussy. They were being brilliant geologists who understood through practice that the origin of the sand was the single greatest factor determining the quality and color of their final product. Finally, there is the question of fuel, which seems simple until you try to feed a Roman furnace for a week. The teams can't just use any scrap wood or modern kiln fuels like gas or propane. To get authentic results, they need to understand how different woods burn. This leads them into the world of forestry and arboriculture. They seek out dense hardwoods like oak, hornbeam, and beech, the same types that would have been available to the Romans in Europe. They learn that these woods not only burn hotter, but also provide a much longer, more stable bed of coals compared to softwoods like pine, which flare up and burn out quickly. Sourcing this wood in the sufficient quantities needed is another lesson in scale. A single experimental firing might consume the entire seasoned output of a small woodlot, a tangible demonstration of the immense environmental footprint of a Roman glass workshop. This makes the location of ancient industrial sites make perfect sense. They are almost always found near forests, but, crucially, also near a river or road. The river wasn't just for water. It was the highway for floating massive quantities of timber from managed forests, far inland directly to the hungry mouths of the furnaces. The search for materials isn't just an academic exercise. It's the key that unlocks the logic of the entire ancient industry, revealing a complex web of geology, trade, and resource management that spanned the entire Mediterranean world. After days of back-breaking labor building the furnace and sourcing materials, the moment of truth finally arrives. The team gathers around the reconstructed kiln, a mixture of anticipation and anxiety hanging thick in the air, almost as palpable as the heat soon to radiate from the clay walls. This isn't just an experiment. It's a high-stakes attempt to commune with the past, to coax a 2,000-year-old recipe back to life. The first step is a process known as fritting, a clever pre-melting technique that reveals the Romans' deep understanding of their materials. They carefully mix their precious, painstakingly sourced sand and natron in the correct proportions. But they don't just shove this dry, gritty powder into the crucible. Instead, they spread the mixture in a shallow layer on a ceramic tile and introduce it to a moderate heat at the front of the furnace. The goal is to trigger an initial reaction, to get the soda to begin dissolving the surface of the sand grain. As the heat works its magic, the mixture doesn't melt into a liquid, but instead fuses into a crumbly, sintered cake that looks like a piece of fragile, opaque sugar glass. This frit is the key. By doing this, they've already overcome a major hurdle. The pre-reacted materials will now melt far more quickly and evenly in the intense heat of the crucible, preventing the lighter soda from simply vaporizing away before it can do its job and ensuring a more homogeneous final glass. It's a simple step, but it speaks volumes about the refined, multi-stage process the Romans had developed through generations of practice. With the frit cooled and crushed into a coarse powder, the real drama begins. The ceramic crucible, itself a handmade replica, is loaded with the material and carefully placed into the glory hole of the now roaring furnace. The fire has been stoked for hours, and the interior is a breathtaking inferno, glowing with a fierce orange-white light. The initial moments are filled with hope, but the wait is agonizingly long. For the first hour, nothing seems to happen. Then, slowly, the edges of the fritted powder begin to glisten, individual grains starting to stick together as the soda works its corrosive magic. The real transformation takes hours more. The modern team, just like their Roman predecessors, must maintain a vigilant watch, constantly feeding the fire to keep the temperature not just hot, but consistently and perfectly hot. Peering occasionally through a viewing port, they witness the gradual birth of the melt. The solid mass slowly collapses in on itself, a sluggish, bubbling pool beginning to form, thick with a foam of escaping gases, and looking less like a magical substance, and more like a pot of boiling, viscous honey straight from a volcano. This is where the potential for catastrophic failure becomes terrifyingly real. The first major hurdle is viscosity. The melt must reach a state where it is fluid enough to be gathered on the end of a blowpipe, but not so runny that it becomes uncontrollable. An experienced glassblower can judge this simply by watching the way the molten glass moves, by the size of the bubbles rising to the surface. A batch that is too stiff will be impossible to inflate and shape. The glass will simply tear and crack. A batch that is too wet or fluid will sag off the pipe like water, refusing to hold any form. The modern team quickly learns that this perfect working state is a narrow window, and it is entirely dependent on the exact chemical composition of their melt and its temperature. Did they get the sand-to-natron ratio exactly right? Is there enough lime present from those tiny shell fragments to stabilize the melt? There are no gauges to tell them. They must read the story told by the glass itself. Then there is the plague of bubbles. A certain amount of bubbling is natural and expected as gases are released from the melting ingredients. But a melt that is too full of bubbles, or one containing a few large, stubborn pockets of air, is useless for creating clear vessels. The Romans developed a technique called fining, which involved holding the melt at a high temperature for an extended period to allow the bubbles to slowly rise out of the viscous liquid and pop at the surface. This requires immense patience and fuel. A modern team, eager to see results, might be tempted to rush this process, only to end up with a crucible full of Swiss cheese-like glass, foamy and fragile. Each large bubble that persists is a testament to a variable they got wrong. Perhaps the temperature wasn't quite high enough, or the fritting process wasn't complete, leaving pockets of unreacted material that continue to off-gas. Solving this isn't a matter of following a recipe. It's about developing a feel for the rhythm of the fire and the behavior of the melt, a knowledge that could only be earned through years of ruined batches and hard-won successes. Perhaps the most visually dramatic failure is the wrong color. Imagine the anticipation as the team prepares to gather the first parison, expecting the prized pale aqua, or nearly clear glass they worked so hard to achieve with their pure sand. But as the blowpipe enters the melt and withdraws with a glowing gather, the color that emerges is a shocking, sickly mustard yellow, or a murky, opaque brown. This immediate and visual disappointment is a direct message from the chemistry of their mix. A yellow often points to unwanted sulfur compounds or a specific iron impurity. A deep brown or green screams of too much iron, revealing that their supposedly pure sand wasn't pure enough. In that moment, they aren't just modern experimenters. They are sharing the exact same frustration a Roman glassmaker would have felt upon opening a kiln to find a failed, discolored batch. It's a visceral lesson in the incredible importance the Romans placed on sourcing the absolute best raw materials from specific, renowned locations. Their entire industry was built on a geographic and geologic knowledge that was every bit as critical as their skill with the blowpipe. Each of these failures, each problem encountered and slowly solved through adjustment and repetition, is not a setback but a revelation. It peels back another layer of the mystery, showing us that the Romans' genius wasn't just in their final, perfect products, but in the immense collective empirical knowledge they built, a deep library of cause and effect written not in books, but in the scars of countless crucibles and the memory of what to do differently next time. Watching a modern master glassblower, someone who can effortlessly shape intricate sculptures with today's refined tools, step up to a reconstructed Roman furnace is a study in profound humility. Their expertise, earned over decades, suddenly seems to vanish into the searing heat. The first and most immediate shock is the sheer brutality of the material itself. The glass produced in a wood-fired furnace is a completely different beast from the consistent, predictable, laboratory-perfect glass rods they are accustomed to. This ancient brew is far less stable, with a viscosity that can change in an instant. Its working window, the critical period between being too hot and too cold to shape, is heartbreakingly short. A modern glassblower might have a minute or more to manipulate a gather. Here they might have 20 seconds, perhaps 30 at most, before the glass begins to stiffen and crack, forcing a frantic return to the glory hole. This frantic dance of heat and motion wasn't just a technique for the Romans. It was an absolute necessity for survival in the medium. Every second of hesitation, every moment of miscalculation, meant a lost piece and wasted fuel. This relentless pressure forged artisans who didn't just think about form, but who operated on pure instinct, their hands and eyes processing information at a speed we can scarcely comprehend. Then there is the intimate, almost adversarial relationship with the tools themselves. A modern blowpipe is a marvel of ergonomic engineering. It's lightweight, perfectly balanced, and coated with a non-stick material that makes releasing the finished vessel a simple tap. The Roman iron pipe, by contrast, feels like a crude and clumsy instrument of torture. It's heavy, throwing off the glassblower's center of gravity. Its surface is rough, causing the molten glass to grip it with a tenacity that makes the final release a perilous operation. But the greatest challenge lies in its most basic function: heat transfer. That solid iron rod acts as a heat sink, leaching thermal energy from the molten gather at an alarming rate, drastically shortening that already brief working time. The modern blower must unlearn their own rhythm and develop a new one, a constant, almost hypnotic rotation that is less about shaping and more about survival. A desperate attempt to keep the heat evenly distributed and the glass from cooling catastrophically on one side. They can no longer stand and contemplate a form. They must be in perpetual motion, a blur of swinging, rolling, and reheating, their entire body engaged in a battle against physics itself. This intense physical struggle illuminates the deepest mystery of all: the nature of Roman expertise. We often picture a master artisan as someone who produces flawless work effortlessly. But the reality revealed by this experimental archaeology is far more compelling. Their mastery wasn't defined by a lack of difficulty, but by a supreme, hard-won competence in navigating constant, overwhelming difficulty. Their skill was measured in micro-adjustments, the subtle change in the angle of a breath, the slight variation in the speed of a rotation, the intuitive reading of the glass's color to gauge its temperature within a margin of a few degrees. They weren't just artists. They were master systems managers, simultaneously monitoring the state of their glass, the heat of the furnace, the weight of the pipe, and the position of their body, all while executing a complex physical maneuver. This wasn't a skill one learned in a year or even a decade. It was a lifetime's pursuit, a knowledge so deeply embodied that it resided not in the mind, but in the muscles and the nerves. The modern glassblower's struggle is our clearest window into this truth, showing us that the perfect Roman vessel we admire in a museum case is not merely a beautiful object. It is the final, frozen testament to a lifetime of failed attempts, burned hands, and shattered dreams. each one a lesson that slowly built the unconscious competence required to finally, miraculously, get it right. Armed with a successful, clear base glass, the modern team now embarks on the most visually dramatic phase of their experimental archaeology, the quest for color. This is where the workshop transforms from an industrial site into an alchemist's laboratory, where bags of mysterious minerals and metal oxides replace simple sand and soda. The process is one of meticulous, measured experimentation, a step back into an era where chemistry was governed by observation and tradition, rather than periodic tables and formulas. For each target hue, the cobalt blue of a perfume jar, the manganese purple of an imperial cup, the antimony yellow meant to mimic topaz, they must first grind the raw mineral into a fine powder, carefully weigh a specific quantity, and then mix it thoroughly into a fresh batch of their fritted base glass. The amounts are tiny, often just a fraction of a % of the total batch weight, a testament to the incredible potency of these natural colorants. It's a delicate dance. A little too much and the color becomes opaque and muddy, too little and it vanishes into a faint, unsatisfactory tint. Each combination is a hypothesis, a best guess based on archaeological evidence and historical texts, about to be tested in the most unforgiving of courts, the crucible's inferno. The first attempts are often humbling lessons in unintended consequences. A batch intended to produce a rich, opaque white using antimony might instead yield a sickly, pale yellow because the furnace atmosphere was ever so slightly off. A mix designed for a deep emerald green using copper might emerge as a disappointing, pale turquoise for the same reason. This is where the Romans' true genius begins to reveal itself. They weren't just adding pretty rocks to glass. They were masters of furnace atmosphere, intuitively understanding the profound difference between an oxidizing fire, rich with oxygen, and a reducing fire, starved of it. The element copper becomes their most powerful and fickle teacher. In an oxidizing flame, copper dissolves into the glass, gifting it a beautiful, transparent aqua blue. But to achieve the legendary and coveted Pompeii red, the same copper must be manipulated in a reducing atmosphere. The modern team learns this through frustrating repetition. They must physically alter the fire itself, partially blocking the air intake or adding green wood to create a smoky, oxygen-poor environment. In these conditions, the copper is forced to precipitate out of the solution not as a dissolved ion, but as billions of microscopic nanoparticles of pure metal suspended in the glass matrix. It is this suspension that scatters the light, creating that stunning blood-red opacity. Getting this transition exactly right is a high-wire act of fire management, a skill that clearly separated the Roman masters from the apprentices. But the ultimate goal, the holy grail of this chromatic quest, is the recreation of the Lycurgus Cup effect. This endeavor feels less like traditional glassmaking and more like a form of ancient nanotechnology. The modern recipe, painstakingly reverse-engineered from microscopic analysis of the cup itself, calls for a minuscule amount of a pre-made gold-silver alloy, ground into an impossibly fine powder. The quantities are almost homeopathically small. For an entire crucible of glass, they might add only a few hundred milligrams of precious metal, so little that a single sneeze could ruin the entire expensive experiment. The mixture is melted and formed into a blank, which appears at first to be a murky, unremarkable greenish lump. The real magic, as the Romans discovered, happens in a second, critically precise heating process called striking. The cooled blank is gently reheated in a smaller kiln to a specific temperature, often just below the point where the glass would begin to soften and deform. It is in this gentle warmth that the alchemy occurs. The gold and silver atoms, which were dissolved throughout the glass, are now coaxed to slowly migrate and cluster together, nucleating into the exact nanometer scale particles that cause the dichroic effect. The tension in the workshop is palpable as the team removes the struck piece from the kiln, and someone holds a flashlight behind it. A collective gasp often erupts when the experiment works. The dull green glass suddenly glows with an ethereal inner light, a luminous ruby red that seems to defy logic. This successful strike is more than just a triumph. It's a direct conversation across millennia. It confirms not only the recipe, but the breathtaking precision of Roman thermal control. They were manipulating atomic structures without any knowledge of atoms, achieving a consistency in particle size that modern technology struggles to replicate without sophisticated equipment. Each successful color, from the simplest blue to the miraculous red, unlocks another entry in the Roman chemical recipe book, revealing them not as mere craftsmen, but as the world's first true materials scientists, whose empirical discoveries would not be scientifically explained for over 1,000 years. And so we arrive at the ultimate test, the moment that separates historical recreation from genuine scientific breakthrough, the attempt to conquer the Lycurgus Cup. For the modern team huddled around their wood-fired furnace, this isn't just another experiment. It's a high-stakes confrontation with one of the greatest material science mysteries of the ancient world. The goal is no longer to make a simple bottle or bowl, but to intentionally and reliably achieve the dichroic effect, to command light itself at a sub-microscopic level. The process begins not with fire, but with meticulous, almost jewel-like preparation. Following clues gleaned from electron microscopy, they know the secret lies in a colloidal mixture of gold and silver. But they can't just toss a coin into the melt. They must first create a custom alloy, fusing precise amounts of the two precious metals together in a small crucible. This alloy is then painstakingly ground by hand using a mortar and pestle, crushed into a powder so fine it feels like silk, and behaves almost like a gas, with a terrifying tendency to float away on the slightest air current. The quantities involved are almost absurdly small. For an entire batch of glass, they might add only a few hundred milligrams of this priceless powder, a mere pinch that represents weeks of labor and a significant financial investment. This minuscule amount is then blended with extreme care into the pre-fritted sand and natron mixture, ensuring every grain of sand has a chance to be touched by a particle of metal. One uneven mix, one tiny clump of alloy, and the entire batch will be ruined, the nanoparticles clustering into useless, large blobs that turn the glass an opaque, muddy brown. The first firing is an exercise in controlled anxiety. As the mixture melts in the crucible, the team watches for any sign of the right color, but they know the true magic won't happen now. The initial melt yields a glass that is, paradoxically, a disappointment. It appears a murky, faintly greenish, or sometimes even a dull vermilion color, completely opaque and showing no sign of the transformative property they so desperately seek. This is exactly as the science predicts. At this stage, the gold and silver are fully dissolved into the glass matrix at a molecular level. The atoms are dispersed, prisoners within the silicon dioxide network. The glass must now be carefully annealed and cooled. The real test of their understanding comes days later in a second, critically precise heating process known as striking. The cooled blank is placed back into a smaller, more easily controlled kiln. The temperature must be raised with agonizing slowness, held at a specific point that is high enough to energize the atoms, but crucially, just below the temperature where the glass itself would begin to soften and lose its shape. This is the narrowest of windows, perhaps only a few tens of degrees wide. Inside this thermal sweet spot, a silent, invisible ballet takes place. The dissolved gold and silver atoms gain just enough energy to break free from their dissolved state and begin to migrate through the viscous glass. They are drawn to each other, nucleating around tiny imperfections to form clusters. The team's entire success hinges on their ability to control the exact time and temperature of this strike. Leave it too long or let the temperature creep too high, and those nascent clusters will continue to grow. Instead of perfect, light-scattering nanoparticles, they will form large, irregular microparticles that simply make the glass opaque and destroy the dichroic effect entirely. The strike is a process of thermal teasing, a way of convincing the material to assemble itself into the precise structure required. The moment of truth is almost anticlimactic in its simplicity. After the striking kiln has cooled back to room temperature, someone simply takes the once murky lump of glass and holds a flashlight behind it. A successful piece will undergo that breathtaking transformation witnessed in the Lycurgus Cup, the dull mass igniting from within with a luminous, ruby glow. The first time it works, the effect is met not with cheers, but with a stunned silence, a profound moment of connection across centuries. It is a victory that goes beyond craftsmanship. It is a validation of our hypothesis, a crucial data point that confirms not only the recipe but the Romans' astonishing, albeit unknowing, mastery of nanoparticle physics. This successful recreation proves that the cup was not a one-off fluke, but the product of a repeatable, albeit incredibly difficult, process. It solves the mystery of how by demonstrating the precise material and thermal steps required. But in doing so, it deepens the even greater mystery of why. It forces us to wonder how many failed attempts, how many crucibles of wasted gold and silver, how many years of empirical experimentation led to that first, miraculous success. Each modern reproduction is a tribute to that lost journey, a tangible echo of the ancient world's most brilliant and beautiful accident. And so after weeks of labor, fueled by equal parts historical curiosity and wood smoke, the moment of reckoning arrives. The modern team gathers not around the furnace, but around a table, their own recreated pieces laid out under the cool, even light of the modern world. Alongside them are high-resolution photographs and detailed drawings of the Roman originals that inspired the entire endeavor. This is the final, unblinking comparison, a chance to see if their empirical journey has truly bridged the 2,000-year gap. The first impression is often one of startling success. A simple bottle, blown from their best batch of clear glass, stands next to an image of its Roman counterpart. The form is nearly identical, the same gentle shoulder, the same kicked-up base, the same subtle tool marks around the pontal scar. The color, that prized pale aqua, is a perfect match. In these moments, there's a powerful sense of connection, a feeling that the team has truly tapped into the same stream of knowledge that flowed through those ancient workshops. It's a testament to the power of their experimental method. By rigorously following the physical evidence, they have successfully reverse-engineered the basics of the Roman process, proving that their fundamental understanding of the recipe and the blowing technique is sound. But as the eye lingers, the subtle, telling differences begin to emerge, and these nuances are where the true lessons lie. The most common discrepancy is in the glass itself. Even the best modern recreation often has a slightly higher number of tiny, trapped air bubbles or occasional faint streaks of undissolved material. The Roman original, by comparison, is frequently flawlessly clear and homogeneous. This speaks volumes about a level of control the modern teams are still struggling to achieve. Did the Romans hold their melts at a high temperature for a day or more, practicing a level of patience and fuel consumption that is difficult to justify in a short-term experiment? Or did their specific combination of raw materials, perhaps with trace elements we haven't yet identified, simply melt more cleanly and smoothly than anything we can source today? This tiny imperfection is a quiet reminder of the generations of incremental refinement that went into the Roman craft, optimizations we can sense but have not yet fully replicated. The comparison of color is where the gaps in our knowledge become most vividly apparent. A modern beaker colored with cobalt might be a beautiful, rich blue, but when placed next to the Roman original, it can look almost garish or too uniform. The ancient piece often has a more complex, deeper hue, with subtle variations in saturation that suggest the mineral was not perfectly mixed, creating a sense of vibrant life within the glass. When attempting the coveted Pompeian red, the difference can be even more pronounced. The modern piece might achieve a good, solid red opacity, but the Roman example possesses an almost luminous quality, a depth of color that seems to glow from within. This suggests that the Roman mastery of the furnace, atmosphere, the precise, intuitive balance of oxidizing and reducing conditions, was far more nuanced than we can reliably achieve in a reconstructed wood-fired kiln. Their red isn't just a color, it's a record of a perfectly managed fire, a skill that was likely the most guarded secret of a master glassmaker. Then there is the matter of form and feel. A modern glassblower can replicate the shape of an ancient vessel with near-perfect accuracy, but the thickness and weight often betray its modern origin. Handling a Roman bottle is a revelation. Despite its apparent delicacy, it feels surprisingly sturdy and substantial in the hand. The walls are exquisitely, consistently thin, yet they possess a remarkable strength. The modern recreation, blown by a master with decades of experience, but only months of practice with these specific tools and materials, often has slightly thicker walls, a hair more weight, a less confident thinness to the base. This is the unmistakable signature of embodied knowledge, the kind that can only be earned through a lifetime of daily practice. The Roman artisan didn't have to think about the rotation of the pipe or the pressure of their breath. It was as natural as walking. That unconscious competence resulted in an economical use of material and a flawless distribution of glass that we can approximate, but not yet perfectly duplicate. The final and perhaps most humbling comparison comes with the most complex pieces. A modern attempt at a mold-blown beaker might capture the general design, but the sharpness of the impressed detail on the Roman original is frequently superior. This implies that the Roman mold makers possessed an incredible understanding of how molten glass flows and behaves under pressure, carving their negative designs with a precision that anticipated the material's slight shrinkage and behavior. Our recreations honor their work, but the comparison underscores that we are still students, deciphering the full depth of a language they spoke fluently. Each subtle difference is not a failure, but a signpost pointing toward a deeper level of understanding we have yet to reach. A silent tribute to a mastery that remains, in some beautiful ways, just beyond our grasp. This tangible proof of their capabilities forces a fundamental shift in our perspective. We can no longer view the Roman Empire merely as a political and military superpower that happened to also make nice glass. Instead, we must now see it as a true industrial and technological titan, one whose workshops were effectively the research and development labs of the ancient world. The consistent replication of complex chemical processes like creating the Lycurgus Cup's nanoparticles, or the stable reds with copper and lead, reveals a systemic, empire-wide capacity for chemical engineering that rivals the output of early modern industries. This wasn't just craft. It was large-scale applied science, conducted with a rigor and consistency that demands we rewrite the history of technology itself. placing Roman industrial prowess centuries, if not a millennium, ahead of where we traditionally located it. This revised understanding completely reshapes the map of the ancient economy. The sheer volume of high-quality glassware found from Scotland to Sudan was only possible because of a staggeringly sophisticated and resilient supply chain. The implications are enormous. It means the shipment of Egyptian natron from the Wadi el Natron to glasshouses in Britain or Gaul was not a rare Chinese letter trade, but a regular, reliable commercial shipping operation, as vital and organized as the grain fleets from Alexandria that fed Rome. The demand for specific hardwoods to fuel these ravenous furnaces implies highly organized forestry management and a transportation network capable of moving massive, bulky resources across vast distances. This glass industry, therefore, becomes a powerful lens through which to view the entire Roman economic engine, revealing it to be far more integrated, specialized, and logistically capable than we previously credited. Their globalized market wasn't just for silk and spices for the elite. It was for the raw materials of industry that supplied the everyday lives of millions. Perhaps the most profound implication strikes at the very heart of how we view ancient knowledge itself. For centuries, we've maintained a strict separation in our minds between the intellectual class, the philosophers, the mathematicians, the engineers who wrote treatises, and the manual laborers, the craftsmen who worked with their hands. This recreation of Roman glassmaking dismantles that artificial barrier entirely. The individual who discovered that choking a furnace's air supply would transform copper from blue to red was not a scholar in a library. He was a craftsman standing before a fire, a brilliant experimentalist operating in a medium of heat and sand. The person who first alloyed gold and silver, added a precise pinch to a glass batch, and then perfected a secondary heating cycle to strike the dichroic effect was a materials scientist, even if that term would have been meaningless to them. Their workshop was their laboratory, and their failures and successes were their data. This suggests a vibrant, largely unrecorded world of intellectual exchange, where complex chemical and physical principles were not written down in Latin, but were instead encoded in recipes, passed down through apprenticeships, and refined through generations of hands-on experimentation. It forces us to accept that some of the most advanced technological knowledge of the ancient world existed not in scrolls, but in the muscle memory and tacit understanding of its master artisans. Ultimately, what we are truly recreating is not just a set of objects, but a mindset. The successful rebirth of these techniques reveals the Roman innovative spirit to be one of fearless empiricism and breathtaking ambition. They saw a material sand, and through relentless experimentation, learned to turn it into something that could hold light, change color, and tell stories. They weren't afraid to waste fuel, to ruin batches, to invest years in perfecting a process whose underlying principles they could never truly see or name. This willingness to engage in such long-term, high-risk experimentation speaks to a culture that valued technological achievement and the prestige that came with producing the impossible. By stepping into their workshops and succeeding in their craft, we don't just solve the mystery of how they made these things, we solve the larger mystery of their world view. We see an empire whose strength lay not just in its legions, but in the collective genius of its craftspeople, whose silent, fiery innovations built a material world of such sophistication that it continues to challenge and inspire our own. So as we stand here amidst the scattered shards of our own experiments and the ghostly echoes of 2,000-year-old furnaces, what have we truly learned on this journey from raw sand to breathtaking art? We've followed the clues, reverse-engineered the recipes, and felt the searing heat for ourselves. We've unlocked the chemical secrets behind their brilliant colors, understanding how a smoky, oxygen-starved fire could transform copper into a glowing crimson. We've even recreated the impossible magic of the Lycurgus Cup, manipulating nanoparticles of gold and silver to command light itself. In so many ways, the veil has been lifted. The how is no longer a complete mystery. Yet, for every question we've answered, a deeper, more profound respect has grown for the people who did it first. We can replicate their tools, but can we ever truly replicate the lifetime of embodied knowledge that allowed a master to feel the perfect viscosity of the glass through a heavy iron pipe? We can reproduce their colors, but can we ever know the countless failed batches, the years of trial and error, the guarded recipes passed in whispers from master to apprentice that led to that first, miraculous red? We can rebuild their furnaces, but can we ever fully comprehend the intuitive genius of the artisan who first looked at a smoky kiln and thought, "What if I change the air?" Our greatest discovery is the immense gap that remains between knowing the steps and possessing the soul-deep artistry. The true mystery was never just the glass. It was the mind of the maker. It was the courage to plunge a hollow rod into a pot of liquid fire. It was the patience to grind a vase for years to bring a myth to life. It was the breathtaking ambition to try, again and again, to turn common sand into something immortal. They worked without textbooks, without microscopes, without any of the safety nets of modern science, guided only by observation, tradition, and an unshakable belief in the possible. That is what continues to inspire awe. They left us more than beautiful objects. They left us a permanent lesson in human potential. This journey of discovery doesn't have to end here. The ancient world is filled with puzzles waiting for curious minds to unravel. What incredible secret should we try to solve next? The lost recipe for Greek fire. The seismic resistant engineering of the Inca. The acoustic perfection of ancient amphitheaters. Let me know what fascinates you in the comments below. Your idea could be the starting point for our next great adventure into the past. If you've enjoyed walking through the workshop of history with us, if you've felt that spark of wonder at what our ancestors could achieve, then be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And please share your thoughts, your questions, and your own theories down in the comments. This isn't just a history lesson, it's a conversation across time, and your voice is a vital part of it. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you on the next journey into the unknown.